Howdy, folks. Mr. Reardon here. I'd like to walk you through the next part of our argument unit, which will be the structure of a basic argument essay. There are a lot of argument structures out there that a person could use to write an argument essay, but I'd like us to start in this class with the fundamental, 4 or 5 paragraph intro body conclusion body paragraph structure. We can then all have this shared fundamental understanding of argumentation, and then start to mess with it and start to make some changes in such a way that you can all become more flexible, more adaptive writers in the genres of argument and synthesis. So, jumping in here, the structure of of the most basic argument body paragraph will follow this general sequence of ideas. So, we'll start with a topic sentence. Now, depending on the prompt, your topic sentence might be based on evidence, or it might be based on subclaims, in the same way that the thesis statement is going to be based either on evidence or subclaims. For the overrated prompt, which is the one I've asked my students this year in spring 2021 to look at, is really lends itself best to a subclaim based as opposed to an evidence based structure thesis statement. And so the topic sentences will be, of course, subclaims, because there's an inherent connection between the topic sentences and the thesis. Though the prompt will really dictate for you what works better, whether it's evidence or subclaims. So then you have, after the topic sentence of the paragraph, you have an evidence unit. This is sort of like the quote unit in analytical writing. It's just slightly different language. You'll have context for the evidence, then you'll unpack the evidence, you'll have explanation and reasoning, and then a transition. Now, this is an important thing to remember. This chunk of stuff can repeat multiple times. You can have multiple evidence units, just like in analysis, where you can have multiple quote units. Here you can have multiple evidence units in an argumentative paragraph. So in the shortest, 40-minute timed argument essay, I would imagine you're going for basic introduction, slim down introduction, 2 paragraphs, or maybe 3. 2 is probably fine. 2 paragraphs with each of which ties to one subclaim or piece of evidence in the thesis, and then a quick slim down conclusion. And there would be 1 evidence unit in each of those paragraphs, and that's it. A slightly more developed paper might have 3 pieces of evidence or subclaims in the thesis statement, 3 paragraphs with 1 or 2 evidence units in each. So just know that this is an iterative process. You can have a paragraph that's written like topic sentence, context, evidence, unpack, explanation, reasoning, transition, context, evidence, unpack, explanation, reasoning, concluding sentence. All right. So, of course, there are a lot of asterisks on this slide. I'll talk about these. For context, just know that this is not the same thing as context when it comes to your introduction, and it's also not the same thing as context when it comes to like introducing a quote in an analytical piece, in rhetorical or literary analysis. It's a different thing. When I say unpack evidence, it is optional in some cases, though I generally recommend you do it in most cases. You have to make a decision, though, about whether or not the evidence needs unpacking. More on this in a few slides. And then there is the transition, which of course is optional if you it's optional because if you only have 1 evidence unit in a paragraph, there's no need for a transition between evidence units. There's only 1. And then the concluding sentence, sometimes you don't need it if your explanation and reasoning is sufficient. And also the concluding sentence might be an extension of explanation and reasoning. They kind of might flow together in a certain way. And this symbol over here means repeat in the world of music. That's why I included it here. So just know, like, this chunk of stuff can repeat several times. It could repeat once, so 2 evidence units. It could repeat 5 times in a giant research paper paragraph or a book chapter. So it's almost infinitely iterative if that's what the argument mandates. All right. So a few of my examples in the first few slides of this presentation will rely on these 2 argument prompts. So I would like you to pause the video right now. Just refresh your memory when it comes to these argument prompts. Make sure you know what they are asking someone to do. All right, you should have paused the video and read those. So moving on. These are now 2 thesis statements that might be written in response to each of those argument prompts you just read. So again, please pause the video, read these 2 thesis statements. They will govern, or they will help you to understand some of the argument body paragraph structure pieces in future slides. All right, a couple notes on these thesis statements before we jump forward. Number 1, the first thesis statement here, the 2016 thesis statement, is an evidence-based thesis statement as opposed to a claim-based thesis. And then down here you have a subclaim-based thesis statement. Up here for 2016, this is a thesis statement that is supporting the claim presented in the argument prompt. Remember that with these prompts, you can support a claim presented, you can refute a claim presented, or you can qualify the claim. Support meaning you agree with what the claim is suggesting. Refute meaning you disagree completely with what the claim is suggesting. And qualify means you agree in some circumstances but don't agree in others, and you will specify what those circumstances are. So for the 2006 thesis statement down here, you have it's a qualified thesis statement. And of course, qualified thesis statements are very hard to make evidence-based. And so this is, of course, a claim-based thesis statement. So again, I'll repeat that it kind of depends on the prompt you have, whether or not you need to use an evidence-based or whether you need to use a claim-based or whether either will work given what you have to write about. So we're going to jump in now to all the pieces of the body paragraph structure that we just looked at a couple slides ago. So the first piece is the topic sentence. The topic sentence should make a claim of some kind. Generally, the claims they echo or even in some cases restate the claims as presented in the thesis statement. If the overall main claim is a claim of policy, which a lot of these argument essays end up doing that, then the subclaims will often end up being claims of value or claims of fact. I would say more often claims of value, though it can vary. And then so these claims will then also be claims of value or claims of fact, as opposed to claims of policy. So the topic sentence claims must tie clearly to the thesis points in a closed thesis statement. So the first subclaim in the thesis ties directly to the first subclaim in the topic sentence of the first body paragraph, and so on with the second claim, third claim, second paragraph, third paragraph. It makes sense. So examples of some topic sentences based on those prompts I just had you read. An early American example of disobedience leading to social progress is the Stamp Act. Or expressions of political perspectives are beneficial to society when constructed and distributed for a wide audience in mind. So these are topic sentences. And again, if you went back and looked at those thesis statements, you would immediately see the connection between these topic sentences and the subclaims or the pieces of evidence in the thesis statements. So of course, if you're using an open thesis statement, like in a longer paper or a research paper, so not an AP style argument essay, your topic sentences might end up needing to do a little more work instead of just sort of echoing the ideas as presented in the thesis statement. The topic sentences might need to be 2 or 3 actual sentences or several clauses in order to help the reader understand the connections between each paragraph. And understand sort of where the argument is going. If you have a main claim and you have a lot of stuff going on in each paragraph, you need to use the topic sentences as one of the ways to help your audience keep track of the line of reasoning as your paper continues. You don't need to worry about this so much for your first couple argument essays in AP Lang, but eventually when you're writing research type papers, you will need to keep that in mind. All right, so next is context for the evidence. This is just any information your reader is going to need to understand your evidence. If you're using an example from history, you'll want to give some historical background. Don't worry about slightly overdoing it. It's much better that you add more context than is really necessary, than not including enough context. Sort of the opposite of a conversation. In a conversation between people, you want to keep the context to a minimum, so you're not overwhelming someone with information and giving them a lecture. But in an essay, you want to do the opposite. You are sort of giving a written lecture to your reader, right? So give the historical background for your evidence and don't hold back. You might need to give setting for anecdotal evidence if you're using the rhetorical mode of narrative. If your evidence is a direct quotation, you of course will need to lead smoothly into it. Use Y tag. This is a helpful strategy for leading into quotes. Who wrote it, when, and where, right? In what kind of text. Now, just know that the rhetorical or literary analysis structure will sometimes work, but it won't always work for context. The important idea is that you're smoothly integrating your quote. So once you have a topic sentence and you're getting ready to integrate evidence, you need the evidence itself. When you're putting together your essay, of course, you might have to decide on the evidence in advance, and then you think about how the context is put together. It may not necessarily go in this order, and that's fine. So evidence in an argument essay needs to be relevant, specific, and sufficient. When I say relevant, what I mean is that your evidence needs to actually support the claim or the subclaim you're making. So ask yourself, right, does this evidence actually support my claim? It's really like a constant iterative double checking with yourself. Like, wait, does this support my claim? Wait, does this work? Is this evidence enough? Do I need to find different evidence? Do I need to adjust the evidence? Do I need to include more of the evidence from this source in order to actually be making this evidence relevant to the specific argument I'm making? This kind of iterative thinking, of course, is a benefit of planning out your paper in advance. We will talk about outlines in this class a little bit later on. So you will, if you can very quickly outline an essay in a specific and prescribed way before actually writing it, it will help you to think this through before you end up writing. And then actually, we will also circle back and you'll learn how to write similar outlines for rhetorical analysis essays. Since you, at least in spring 2021, that's one of the things we did not cover first semester because of our reduced instructional minutes. So second thing evidence needs to be is specific. The specific generally means clearly defined or identified. This could be numbers, data, statistics, could be telling a story, right? So giving details, selecting with care, of course, don't overdo it. But like who, what, when, where, right? What happened, give the information. Maybe you need to include the names of people involved. Maybe you need to include colors, right? Smells, tastes, other sensory experiences to capture your audience and help them to understand the experience of the story you're telling. And then, of course, you need to make sure you're relaying the events in order. You don't need direct quotes, especially if this story you're telling is like from history, for example. You can paraphrase in this context. You don't have to memorize quotes. Your evidence also needs to be sufficient. So the question is, do you have enough evidence? You always have the right in argumentation to bring in more evidence than you would for rhetorical analysis. In rhetorical analysis, you might have a quote that's, 2, 3 clauses, 2, 3 sentences. Evidence chunks of paragraphs could be 2 sentences. They could be 10 or plus sentences or anything in between in argumentation. You should, or of course, within reason, given the scope of your argument, more evidence is often better. So do you have enough? So question, where do you get your evidence from? Well, we talked about this when looking at the argument prompts. The evidence in an AP-style argument essay written under testing conditions and a time constraint has to come out of your brain. So some types of evidence you might use from semester 1 would be personal experience, current events, historical information, expert opinion, quantitative evidence, these kinds of things. So this is in general the kind of thing you're looking for when you're consuming media, because you can then harness that, whether directly quoted or paraphrased, when writing these argument essays. So let's be more specific here. You can get any of this kind of evidence from independent reading books, from podcasts, from articles, films, any media you consume, whether it's for school or not for school. You can pull from content in any of your Pali classes. So if you're taking a history class and you've learned, maybe you're in U.S. history and you just learned about the Gilded Age, and you have a really complete, detailed understanding of, the Gilded Age. You could use any evidence from that learning you've done as evidence in an argument essay. You can also pull from your areas of interest or knowledge. So let me tell you, if I had to write a timed essay on many of those argument prompts that you've seen so far, the AP released prompts, I would try my very best to pull from the things I know a lot about, right? I happen to know a whole lot about school and education. And so, as an educator, so that would make sense. I'm going to try to pull from that as much as I can. Not every prompt would lend itself well to that, of course, but if you can figure out a way to bridge connections between, or bridge any gaps between your authentic interests and things you know a lot about and the prompt you're asked to write on, it will unlock for you just this avalanche of evidence you can pull into these prompts. And of course, when you're not writing essays in timed, restrictive testing circumstances, you can pull from websites, academic journals, books you seek out, interviews, videos, right? There really are few limits to where you can get your evidence from, as long as you have reliable sources. We will talk more about reliable sources later. So your evidence has to be specific, as I mentioned, and I want to circle back to this idea. I want to give you this another look at the idea the concept called the ladder of abstraction. We referenced this when looking at the prompts last week, but it is, I never really gave you a visual like this, so I want you to have a chance to see it. In the ladder of abstraction, there are 4 levels. The base level, the lowest level, is a very specific thing that you can point to and look at, or in some cases pick up and throw, or you can imagine in your brain. It's a very concrete thing. And the highest level is an abstract idea, something that exists only in the minds of humans. If every human in the whole world, on the whole planet, suddenly disappeared and ceased to exist, then these things would also no longer exist, because they are only things that humans conceive of, and they're not like physical objects. There are a bunch of examples here. Carl's sister Tracy, is the fundamental level. She might fall into a category of spoiled children. Spoiled children might fall into a category of people or most people, and then or some chunk of people. Maybe young people might be a better thing to put in that box, honestly. And then humanity is on top. So with the third one we can look at here with economy, Bessie the cow is a single cow. She falls into a category of cattle. Cattle are part of agricultural assets, which have some functioning in the economy. If you go back far enough, just like in Wikipedia, clicking on the first non-language link in Wikipedia articles, if you try to keep going back too far, you'll just end up at philosophy. That's where everything goes back to. But if you sort of stop at this fourth level, then you will end up at the kinds of abstract ideas asked about on the AP Lang argument prompts. So you could kind of do the same thing here with success. So if you want to actually pause and practice that, feel free. I am going to move on to the next slide here, though. So the next thing you have to do, once you have a topic sentence, you have chosen and introduced your evidence smoothly, you have enough evidence, you have specific evidence that supports your claim, you then will probably need to do some unpacking of the evidence. This is not always the case. If the evidence is obvious, don't restate it. If it stands on its own and doesn't need additional unpacking or additional explanation, don't do it. What that ends up sounding like is just you repeating exactly what the evidence says instead of making an argument, which is bad. That's like lower end, 2-1 earning essays on the 6-point AP rubric. So you have to unpack your evidence when the evidence itself is not necessarily clear to your audience, or it needs additional explanation or additional clarification before you can then step into the process of tying that evidence or using that evidence to explain your reasoning in the paragraph. So here are some ways you might unpack evidence when you discover that you need to. You might accurately restate what the author is saying in very different language, in clearer, simpler, more accessible language. And this is generally done right after a direct quotation. So let's say the quote is obscure. It is difficult to understand. It is written in a particularly challenging, opaque prose. It uses a lot of jargon, which is actually the next piece here. There's complex terminology in the evidence that might not be familiar to a wide swath of the audience. So you have to unpack that, right? Say what is actually meant in simple terms for the reader. I gave you a few little sentence frames that you might use when first practicing this, though later I think you can figure out what ways work best for you. So here, person or writer suggests that something, or when writing blank, this writer implies that blank. So another thing you could do when you're unpacking evidence is actually build on the evidence. So you give a piece of evidence, and then you immediately give another piece of evidence, and then you write a couple sentences explaining the relationship between these two pieces of evidence. This is great for data. One piece of data by itself, like a percentage or something, might not stand very well on its own when you're building an argument. But if you include a percentage and then it's some other piece of data that goes with the percentage, that percentage then might become much more meaningful for your readers and will make it easier and more compelling for you to write the rest of your argument. So next we have explanation and reasoning. In your explanation and reasoning, I'd like you to explain how and or why your evidence supports your topic sentence claim. So you might use language from your unpack evidence sentences to help you move forward with your explanation. If you just clarified what the evidence really means for your reader, then use that language and not the actual evidence itself to help drive your explanation or your line of reasoning within the evidence unit. Here are some things you might talk about. Right? What are the implications of your evidence? What do they suggest, or what do they mean? What are some logical conclusions one might draw from the evidence given the circumstances? What conflict might exist between two pieces of evidence you included and what they imply? So please be sure in your explanation or reasoning that you avoid making new claims that require new evidence. You need to keep talking about the same evidence you presented throughout your paragraph. Develop your reasoning. Please also avoid fallacious reasoning, avoid argumentative fallacies, which are weak arguments. We will talk about those later, of course. You will have a chance to learn and think about a wide swath of the fallacies that exist, though there are just a huge number of them. So there's no one-size-fits-all structure for evidence and reasoning. I think this is the most important thing I can tell you here, honestly. It's not like in rhetorical analysis where I can tell you, if you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you do that thing one at a time and you just follow the structure, you'll end up with a good paper, even sometimes a great paper without a lot of extra thinking beyond the structure itself. But in argumentation, it's just not that way. I can't do that for you because every argument is different. Every argument can be made great, made highly sophisticated in a slightly different way. And so you as the writer have to figure that out. You have to forge the logical connections between the different ideas in your explanation and reasoning in a way that works for your argument. You'll notice that I put a little GIF of some forging happening in the on the left-hand side there. And I think that I really want to drive home this idea of forging, right? Forging is like making something, doing hard work to make something out of materials that are not always, that don't necessarily lend themselves well to manipulation and creation. This is often true of ideas and of logical arguments, but you have to do that hard work, like our little nerdling there is doing with the metal. So the best way to get better at explanation, given this reality, is to simply read a lot of good explanation, then write a lot of explanation as practice, get better at it, get better at developing it, get better at not holding back and doing as much explanation as you can. And then, of course, getting feedback on your writing from other people, from people more experienced than you are when it comes to argumentation. Of course, doing all of these things are on the agenda for the near future in this class. So the last piece here is a concluding sentence. After all of your evidence units, you will need to close your paragraph. You could use a conclusion transition phrase like in short, in the end, in sum, thus, finally. You could return to the claim in your topic sentence and your thesis. If it's possible, given what your prompt is, you might also try to build in the name of the person whose claims you are considering, or the name of the person who provided the evidence you're using. So drop a name, do a name drop in the concluding sentence of the paragraph. This is a particularly sophisticated move that you can do in your concluding sentences, and it'll drive home for that AP reader that you know what you're talking about, that you can structure an argument, and that you have this sort of very high level of executive functioning, executive understanding of all the pieces of your argument and how they fit together. All right, last words here. This presentation covered the most traditional structure of an argument essay, right? Essentially the 5-paragraph essay. There is so much more that you can do with an essay than just this structure. We're going to talk about counter arguments in the synthesis unit. Between now and the synthesis unit, we will also talk about some other approaches that you can take that are modifications of this basic structure, and that will allow you to be even more flexible a writer in this genre. If you are my student watching this video, the practice that you'll do for this class will be given to you in Schoology, so you'll want to look at it there. If you're not my student, though, and you're just some person watching this video on YouTube, I recommend that you practice writing the essays using the released exam prompts. If you just Google AP Lang released argument prompts, you'll have access to essentially all of them back to like 2005. Just pull one out, write an introduction, try to write a couple paragraphs, see what happens, maybe get some advice from someone who's more experienced than you when it comes to argumentation, revise, keep practicing. The more practice you get, the better you'll get at it. And of course, reading arguments too is a great way to get better at writing them. Alrighty, that's all I have for you folks. Thank you